Good morning and welcome to worship. I bring you the good news of the gospel today on behalf of Centennial Lutheran Church in Colorado. My name is Pastor Dina Williams, and this is the second Sunday after Pentecost. The Holy Gospel according to the community of St. Mark in the 3rd chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Then he went home. Jesus went home to Galilee. The crowd following him came together again. So many people surrounded Jesus, there was not room to even eat. Standing room only. When Jesus' family heard about the huge gathering, they went out to restrain Jesus, to bind him, to tie him up. Because people were saying about Jesus, he has gone out of his mind. And the scribes who came down from the temple in Jerusalem said, Jesus has a demon. He is possessed by Beelzebul, the ruler of all demons. And it is in the name of the ruler of demons that he casts those out from other people. Jesus called the scribes to him, and he spoke to them in parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, it cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand. But his end has come. Whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness. He is guilty of an eternal sin. Jesus said that because the scribes had said, Jesus has an unclean spirit. Blasphemy. Pretty soon, Jesus' mother and brothers came outside their houses, and they stood on the edge of the crowd. And they sent for Jesus, calling him to come to them, so they could restrain him, bind him, tie him up, because some in the crowd told them that Jesus was out of his mind. The crowd sitting around Jesus said to him, your mother and your brothers and sisters are at the edge of the crowd, and they are asking for you to come to them. But Jesus replied, who are my mother and my brothers? Then looking at all of those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Mark's gospel, my favorite. Beginning today and for all of the Sundays in June, July, and August this year, our gospel stories will come from the Gospel of Mark. And the writer of the gospel does not mess around. In Mark, Jesus is baptized, spends 40 days in the wilderness, calls his disciples. He goes to Capernaum to the synagogue, teaches the people. A man with an unclean spirit comes into the synagogue. Jesus casts out the man's demons. The people are amazed. Who is this? He teaches new things with authority. He commands the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Jesus' fame began to spread throughout all of Galilee. Then Jesus goes from the synagogue to Simon's house. He cures Simon's mother-in-law of an illness, and then that evening the people gather around him, and he cures many who are sick and have various diseases. He casts out demons. Jesus takes his disciples on a preaching tour to the neighboring town. In rapid succession, Jesus cures a leper and a paralytic, then he eats with sinners, then he proclaims the meaning of the Sabbath, he cures a man with a withered hand, he goes to the seaside where great numbers of people from all over the countryside come to hear him teach. Jesus appoints the 12 disciples, and then he goes home in today's gospel story. And all of these events occur in just the first 2 chapters of Mark's gospel. Wow. There is an urgency in this gospel. Mark's gospel is written in simple, street Greek so that the average person can understand it. Now, since we begin 3 months of hearing stories from Mark today, stories that are told in chronological order, I encourage you to read this gospel, beginning to end in the next week or so. Seriously, yes. It's the shortest gospel. It won't be painful, I promise. Read it for yourself. Or even better, read it aloud with family or a friend. As a matter of fact, how many of you will promise to read Mark's gospel in its entirety during the month of June? Raise your hands. Okay. Now, there was once a new pastor who came to a congregation, and for 4 weeks in a row, the pastor preached about telling the truth. 4 sermons in a row on telling the truth. And the people were not happy, and the president of the congregation was appointed to go and speak with the pastor about this repetitive message. The pastor listened and nodded. The next Sunday, at the conclusion of the sermon, once again a sermon on truth-telling, the pastor asked the people to please read the 17th chapter of Mark in the week to come, before next Sunday. He asked them to raise their hands and promise. And most everyone raised their hand and promised to read the 17th chapter of the Gospel of Mark before next Sunday. The following Sunday, he began by asking, how many kept your promise and read Mark chapter 17? And many people raised their hand. And then the pastor said, there is no 17th chapter in the Gospel of Mark, and I will continue to preach on telling the truth. Mark's gospel. So much happens in so little time. What does this mean? What is so important to this gospel writer? Why does he tell the story in such a rapid style? Why doesn't he give us some time to stop and smell the literary roses like John does? Why? Because of the Romans. The Roman government and soldiers who control the people, who make the laws, who arrest and punish those who resist their rule, those who protest. The Romans even control the synagogue in Jerusalem. The Romans, you see, are very busy writing decrees and making new laws, and demanding new oppressive taxes, and policing and arresting and killing anyone who objects. And when the Romans issue their demands in written form, guess what they call their documents? Gospels. They call them gospels. The word gospel means good news. This is what the Roman government calls their oppressive, murderous, unjust documents. Gospels. Good news. The writer of Mark then knows an urgency to write another sort of gospel. A gospel to proclaim the good news of Jesus, to share the love and forgiveness and grace, the healing and sacrifice of God's Son. A gospel of genuine good news. Among the 4 gospels in our sacred book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first gospel written down and copied and shared among the people was indeed this gospel, the good news from the community, from the writer of Mark. No wonder the writer of the gospel feels urgency in the face of those other gospels, those Roman gospels. Mark writes a new gospel. It behooves us then, I think, to read this gospel. A gospel written to proclaim God's love to the people of the first century. A gospel written to proclaim God's love for all people. To proclaim God's never-ending no matter what love for us. Read it. It's the shortest of the 4. Only 16 chapters. And you promised. Amen.